stress is the number one thing that starts to erode the microbiome's lining, okay, and create inflammation. So if that's happening, then we don't have the ability to, in the small intestine, uptake the nutrition, or we have holes in our microbiome's lining, which is allowing different food particles, different chemicals, things that are supposed to be transferred out of the body to go into the matrix of our body, and that creates inflammation. And inflammation in our body is basically an alarm bell.
That is B.G. Mancini, a neuro-integrative medicine provider with nearly 30 years of experience supporting children and families. She's advanced certified in functional medicine, an acupuncture physician, and the creator of the family nervous system. BG specializes in helping people understand the connection between gut health, sensory input, and nervous system regulation, guiding them toward deeper connection, safety, and resilience. Welcome to Wired for Connection, a Polyvagal podcast. I am your host, and my name is Travis. So BG, I'm so excited to be able to talk to you today and kind of what we're doing here at Wired for Connection. And I think having you on as part of the just the kind of foundation and kind of opening our eyes a bit to the integration of polyvagal theory is this is going to be a really fun episode. And so what I would love to know is kind of what led you specifically to use polyvagal theory as a lens into like gut health and neurointegrative medicine. Can you tell us a bit about like what got you there?
Sure. So I found polyvagal theory actually through working with Dr. Porges's SSP program when I was really focused on working with children with autism. And so when I started entering into that world through SSP, I then learned all about polyvagal theory and the concept. And, Dr. Porges had done work specifically with autistic individuals many years before. And so then I learned, from his perspective that there was this trauma response that was occurring and impacting the neurodevelopment, the ability to express and connect. And that really sort of just folded in like a torrent and echoed into everything that I started re-looking at what I was doing. And what I reimagined is that actually what I had been doing for now almost 30 years is actually helping individuals to create safety in their body as their experience so that they could then reemerge as themselves and connect and make more meaningful relationships.
And what were you doing for 30 years prior to like discovering Stephen Porges' SSP?
So I have been working with nutrition, lifestyle changes. This goes back to macrobiotic days, where Michio Kushi was one of my first teachers, and understanding, and he was very far ahead of his time. And when I look back at what I learned from him, it was very congruent with polyvagal theory. He talked about eating in community, being outside in nature, which he didn't use the word co-regulating, but that he said helped to harmonize our nervous systems. And he talked about eating in season, the foods that were around us, because it helped us to connect more deeply with our environment. And so even though the language, and he was primarily a Japanese speaker, but the language was still there. And it's why I so deeply connected with his work. And then from there, I studied Chinese medicine, studied health sciences, and then ultimately, blended all this into what I'm doing today.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing the story of like where you started, that there's this kind of truth, if you will, that you've heard in different spaces, and seeing how really it's just the same thing, just different language. And that's where leading up to the point of using SSP and polyvagal theory was that kind of integration or synthesis of really all of it. It's so fascinating that I like that eating in community, right? That in nature, that very much aligns with kind of co-regulation and nervous system response, that
Exactly.
when we're safe enough, we can eat and have a shared meal, which, in a way is communicating safety with people and like kind of connection.
Right. And being in that community was one of the most joyful times in my life, because we all, worked together, we cooked together, we ate together, and, we were in a beautiful setting in the mountains. And that really, it's one of the images that I always have, when I'm cooking dinner for my family, is I imagine there's like a video camera above my head at the stove, and then it sort of pulls up onto my street. There's lots of us at the stoves down our street, and then it pulls up to the community and to the state, to the world, but we're all in our separate, isolated spaces doing that same thing. Whereas, not that long ago in our evolutionary history, were we doing these things together, and what a difference that might feel like for me, for my family, playing with other kids in that moment and all of us sharing that meal together.
I like that zooming out of like you see this connection, even though there's some disconnection between our modern day, you could still feel this connection and resonate with what other people are doing in their homes. So it's not so isolative. And I have similar practices with some kind of meditative prayer practices that I do, that I know that people around the globe are doing this very thing.
Yes.
So I feel the sense of connection, almost kind of what Dan Siegel talks about, this kind of interconnection with things, not just me, this body, but there's a connection with nature, with the world, with the community, that when we can have that perspective, it really does, it kind of can help fight isolation and loneliness, because it's like, no, there's people doing this thing, and I'm a part of something bigger than myself, whether I'm cooking food, eating in community. Now, though, I think there is something to say that actually eating in a community, it obviously is, I think, more intention of what we're intended to do, but we can still have that sense of connection bigger than ourself.
And what you just said is really important, because, when we eat in community, our digestive enzymes are different. When we are laughing and enjoying and smiling, right, we know that the chemical cocktail that's coursing through us in order to break down, absorb, and utilize our food is completely different. And so the difference between eating either with your family or with a community, or the different mood that we're in when we're eating, makes nutrition completely differently available. And so I would say for sure that if that opportunity is there to do that, or even the difference between sitting in front of a computer rather than actually tasting our food, paying attention to what we're eating, chewing our food. This is where our starches get broken down. And so, I always say, like, this is the entry point. Actually, the entry point for all digestion is what we look at, right? Because our body is already aware, right, predictively, what's going to happen when that food enters. I guess you could say, like, thinking about it, because sometimes that also can, we trigger that digestive process. But when it goes in and we're chewing, and if we're, how we're breathing, all of that plays into the role of our health, of our microbiome, of our overall digestive process.
And as a quick little, kind of trailer, so to speak, of what we're going to talk about today, like exactly, it's let's just jump into that more, like this connection between, I'm already giving the image of, like, you're right, like as I look at food, there is things happening, and what is my mood? And so I want to talk a bit more about that, because I think it's so important in the work that you've done that maybe people aren't really thinking about or aware of, but that connection between gut and brain and our nervous system state. Like, I think one of the first things I think about is, especially since often we're looking at, kind of dysregulation and how do we move toward regulation. So I'm wondering how dysregulation in the nervous system, how does that contribute to like gut issues or GI issues or digestive issues? Like, how does that interplay, and what do you see happening in like the clients you work with?
So I would say, of course, Steve talks about, the neuroceptive lens, or our neuroception, right? And so, when I hear the word, dysregulation, it's, of course, that's like a flowing state, right? We're always moving through, or if you think of, some people like to think of it as a pendulum, between things. And so, when I'm in a state that I feel at ease, and I'm in that rest and digest, more towards a parasympathetic engagement state, then we are biologically available to then create the right chemicals to break down our food, the peristalsis, which is controlled by the vagus nerve, various parts of the brain, something called central pattern generators. And then what is happening in the muscles of the stomach themselves, since that all is happening automatically, autonomically, right? And so then it goes down to the gut, and whether or not we're creating enzymes to break the food down, but also, stress is the number one thing that starts to erode the microbiome's lining, okay, and create inflammation. So if that's happening, then we don't have the ability to, in the small intestine, uptake the nutrition, or we have holes in our microbiome's lining, which is allowing different food particles, different chemicals, things that are supposed to be transferred out of the body to go into the matrix of our body. And that creates inflammation. And inflammation in our body is basically an alarm bell. I love how Steve calls it, end organ damage or end organ involvement, right? Because that inflammation that's now occurred because of this one process becomes a systemic inflammation. And since our gut is what is conveying right up to the brain so many of a large part of our signaling, then once it gets there, the brain has interpreted some type of a threat, and now that again goes back into the gut and triggers more inflammation. Essentially, I mean, I'm breaking it down in a very simplistic way. But.
Yeah. Well, I think even when I hear that, it's like I don't know how much we're taught about that, the connection between nervous system state and gut health, and how that has a direct impact on brain, mood, digestion, and then how it can create, in this example, a feedback loop of just like staying stuck in. Just it kind of feeds it's like a poison that keeps going back and forth, because then you're stuck in dysregulation. The gut makes more stress, then that creates more. I could see now how people can get so stuck in having inflammation issues. And I'm like, can you speak a little bit more about the like breaking it down even more with the influence of how the gut influences mood or brain function or emotional resilience or emotional expression? Because I think that's something that, myself included, like we're not thinking about, like, ooh, my gut and how that this is having an impact on me right now. I think there's some level of disconnection or lack of awareness of like, oh, I need to pay attention to that.
Right. Well, so you just said so many. I'd like to unpack that a little bit.
Please do.
So you said the disconnection, right? So there's a reason why we talk about our gut feelings. And I always say that our interoceptive cues, the signals that we're receiving consciously or unconsciously from inside of our body, were meant to lovingly guide us, right? So that we can make adjustments, either what we were intaking or what's around us, to then create more homeostasis. However, I think what's happened, I have no exact evidence of this, but I think what's happened is that we have received we are living in a time where our input through our senses, our five senses, through our proprioception has changed. We don't move around as much necessarily. The environment around us, light, artificial lighting and how that impacts our melatonin and our circadian rhythm, and then our sleep. All of this is intricately tied together. So I think a lot of people turn away from those cues. So in other words, I sense something, it's not comfortable, and so I don't want to feel it. And so I'm going to use my phone as an adaptive mechanism to sort of check out, or I'm going to binge watch something, or I'm going to drink a bottle of wine, or engage in some kind of behavior to create relief from the concern or the actual inflamed feeling that I'm sensing. Does that?
Yeah, no. Yeah, that totally makes sense. It makes sense that that gut sense, and how we avoid it because either we're unfamiliar with it, or don't know what to do with it, or don't know what it's trying to communicate to us. But we know it doesn't feel good, or
right.
It feels uncomfortable, or I don't like it, or something's off, and so it's just another stressor. And so I just need to check out tune out, especially if that's been my primary mechanism of just like managing the stress of life, is just to keep going there. And that could, if we're disconnected from what our body's trying to say, especially the gut, I mean, we're going to keep, every time we sense that, it's like an auto responsive, okay, check out, tune out, binge watch, whatever, drink, eat. And they might even eat more food that exacerbates it too. Like I could imagine people eat, they overeat or something, and then now it's exacerbating it. And then you have the emotions tied to it. So how does that connect? Yeah.
So, and I make this point to sort of lead into that. If someone has a traumatic brain injury, with the research shows that within 48 hours, there's going to be gut involvement. Now, the reason that's so key is because if you think about traumatic brain injury, actually on a QEEG can also look like chronic stress. It can look, because there's different parts of the brain, of course, in a TBI that can be impacted, but repeated high levels of stress start to take on this trauma injury type of pattern. And so the reason that happens is because of the brain gut axis, right? It is literally all connected. And I think what a lot of people are experiencing now is this either low level or high level anxiety. There is this feeling of not wanting to stay in our body. We want to keep checking out because we have so much input and our nervous system is not sure how to come back into regulation. So, first of all, the research right now is finally catching up. The microbiome research can actually show patterns associated with specific addictions. So it's a microbiome pattern that's different for heroin, for alcohol, for cocaine, a microbiome pattern that's different for schizophrenia versus anxiety versus depression, right? So there's now chicken or the egg, right? But it's all, but either way, because whatever it is, whether that pattern then caused that person to start to move into that direction, and it's always and that is now creating that feedback loop that's exacerbating the situation, right?
Yeah.
And so then what happens is the chemical cocktails that are getting created, our brilliant brains have these receptors, right? So then if you are creating, if the stress chemical cocktail is a very potent one, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So if we are under that chronic stress all the time, our brilliant brain receptors essentially alter themselves and make more of those receptors that are now craving that chemical cocktail just like it's a drug. And so I've had people tell me, yeah, I'll be feeling a little bit better, and then I'll have an anxious thought. And then if I roll with that thought, I can feel this rush, and it's almost fulfilling its purpose. And the interesting thing to me is that there are certain foods that have the same effects, right? So gluten and dairy actually hit some of the same receptors as heroin. So I've had people go through, they call it the gluten flu or dairy detox because their milk butyrophilin is actually an addictive component to it, and our brain, and that's why people, when we eat ice cream or we eat a piece of cake or something, it's not just the sugar, it's actually this endorphin rush that happens in our brain.
Interesting. Well, and just to, makes me think as you're talking, so many clients I've worked with, change is hard because to change, it's like that. I think of sometimes that cocktail, that intense rush isn't always there when they're trying to do something that might be more holistically healthier for them. Even to get to ventral, I think initially I've seen where it's sometimes can be harder because it's like it's unfamiliar, and that cocktail where they're maybe used to having such high hits of this kind of intense cocktail isn't there, or it's different, and so the almost like the brain can't read it right. So I think of one client of mine, like ADHD and procrastination, and so waiting for the moment before something's due. Now I got that intense, I would say now, cocktail of anxiety, stress hormones to then force me to wake up to do this thing that I've known that's been due for 2 months. In a way, that's how I'm reading it. Like, I wonder if how that fits like with what you're talking about, like that it releases all that, because now it's like that gut stress is releasing. Now I have this rush of energy, sympathetic mobilization, adrenaline, anxiety to now deal with the problem, the threat of this project. When for 7 weeks prior, I was just kind of like, I'll get there, because it's almost maybe that cocktail was missing. How does that
So
fit?
I follow the thread that you went on, and I would say yes and.
Yes, and yeah. Well, please, yeah. Add. This is the whole. Yeah, add to it. Yes.
And so, what it makes me think of is I was just reading some research done yesterday, or came out yesterday, where certain shows for children are now having these 3-second changes. I found them intolerable for my nervous system. I mean, not just the content, but the way the camera moved, the amount of times that the screen changes happened. My visual system, and one of my dear friends is a developmental optometrist. So I called her and I said, I am having visual issues and headache in my head. Like, I want to just run away from watching this. She's like, you're not used to these fast system changes. And so children, when you are growing up, when you're a digital native to that, can you imagine that the hits that you're getting every time that screen change happens, right? Then your receptors are now developing in order to only appreciate that type of speed of input. So the way she describes it is, who in this new generation is going to be able to sit and watch an opera? Okay, that's the way she says it, because it's literally the slowest payoff, and its rhythm, its rhythmicity is so different than what people are experiencing today.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about those payoffs, I think there's like this really intricate play of our brain's development and what age were we exposed to this faster input of information, so that we can then. Now, the beautiful thing is that this is all changeable. Right? And there are even, neuroplasticity. One of the ways that I got into this work in the first place, I was 15 years old when my niece had a double cord wrap injury at birth. So she was hypoxic. She was told she would never walk, talk, or speak. And we found the work of someone called Goodman, who was already using neuroplasticity exercises without the word. So this is going back now 35 years ago. And through crawling, right, through frequency, intensity, and duration of these different exercises, the brain started to recover because it has this amazing neuroplastic ability. And I think that for in order to do that, to help us to get in time, and especially for the younger generations, if we grew up at a certain time that things were slower, so our baseline was used to that. So we might get caught up into this faster input, which I find that each generation has a different tolerance for it. And then the younger generation, that is their digital native receptor self. Then I always encourage parents, there's different things that you can do at home. I mean, I can just share them here if you're open to it, that help to. There's different programs, like there's something called Interactive Metronome, or anything with a metronome, anything that has a timing, that if they're doing exercises or you're playing a game, put on a metronome app for free on your phone and slow it down a little bit and get them to jump at even a little bit slower pace, or get them to bounce the ball or play patty cake in time. What that actually does at a brainstem level is help to bring the nervous system and the brain into coherence with time and space.
Well, now you're making me think of so many things that is popping in my head, that like music, like playing piano or learning guitar, like why that could be so so nervous system resetting because you are learning to play. And the metronome, that makes sense. Like, absolutely. It's like this rhythm that your body can, heart and blood can kind of adjust to, because it's something you can focus on. I'll definitely try that with my kids. And shows for sure, because I choose shows for my kids that aren't Cocomelon, because I can't. Same thing. I've tried. I'm like, what? I get overwhelmed. I'm like,
That's
this
it.
is
just like a question mark.
Just like, what is this? And so all the shows we picked and from our kids, when they have watched, have been really slow, calming. Oddly enough, a lot of like BBC shows. Like one of our favorites when our kids were young was a show called Sarah and Duck. Essentially, it's about a little girl named Sarah and her pet duck that would go on adventures. It was real muted colors, not overly bright, quiet, soft music. I was like, I was relaxed and my kids were relaxed.
Just listening.
It was super, just like, oh, I like this. It's just like soothing, and it's like they're learning and the whole show is them exploring just the day of like a rainbow or rain or flying a kite. It's like basic things, but it's so calming.
Being intentional about what our kids are watching.
Totally.
It's a challenge,
Yeah.
It's a challenge for parents, right? Because I feel like our nervous systems, right, when we get into threat and when we get into stress and when we're overwhelmed, we don't want to say no to our kids. We want them to be occupied because we're so afraid of what their needs are going to be of us when we're feeling at our bandwidth. And so, I think, the quote about, a child will do well when they can. I like to say, a parent will do well when they can, right? All parents want to do the best for their children as possible, and they want to be enjoying that oxytocin exchange, and they want that because that nourishes, what I call the family nervous system. However, when they're in that heightened stress state, and especially, of course, COVID's like this defining moment in our lifetime of, not feeling safe, not feeling safe in engagement, in relation to others, and then what the children went through with that process, with parents being less available to themselves or to the rest of the family unit, so that that regulation of, can we take a moment to draw some advisory notices in our home of what the kids will be exposed to, knowing that it actually will feed back in a better way. And they are such receptive little sponges, love them, that they are often super open to this idea of, hey, and here's why. And I saw that with when people started first bringing me their children, and I would tell the kids, okay, here's what I see, and here's why I think you shouldn't eat this, and let's see if you feel differently. And then the parents would tell me, they would, send messages through the app or whatever and say, at dinner, she said that you said this, and this, and none of us should eat that because we don't want to feel that way. Kids love to be a part of the family, feel like they're supporting the family. And so I love the idea of starting that conversation in homes about, hey, here's what sometimes this can make people feel. And if you don't want to feel that way, let's try eating something different, adding something different in to support ourselves, watch something different, because all of our sensory input, the one that we're aware of, the ones we're aware of, and the neuroceptive input lens, right, and how it's being interpreted, contributes to every moment in that dynamic.
Yeah. And again, but this comes back to awareness, knowing the connection between, mind, body, or gut and brain, knowing that it has a direct impact, and using that lens and framework, I think, for parents or just even non-parents, to use it as a helpful perspective to understand that there is a connection. I think, again, that going back to the word disconnection, if we're in a state of disconnection, then we're going to, I think, remain stuck and disconnected. But we know that there's a connection really among everything. Not to be overwhelmed by that, but more invited into, as I begin to pay attention to all these things, whether it's the food that I eat, the shows that I watch, what I do with my time, that all these things have a direct impact on my emotional health, my mental health, my gut functioning, my nervous system. Then we begin to really take seriously kind of everything that we do and all that we engage with and how. I know Dr. Porges talked about how our autonomic state can shape our experience. And I'm wondering, chronic stress, and you kind of hinted at this with like a traumatic brain injury, how like chronic stress can also cause similar impact. But how has chronic stress impacted digestion? How we either a little more on how we actually absorb nutrients in our food or not? And I know you mentioned the holes and the microbiome, all these different things. So like, how does chronic stress, and not only how, and that's part one, part two is, well, how do we shift that? Because I want to know a little bit of what it does and the impact that we might experience maybe as adults right now that you probably work with. But then what do we do to shift that? How do we move from that chronic stress, leaky gut, nutrient lack of absorption, and getting stuck in this kind of cycle to now, what do we do to shift?
It goes back to sort of what you were saying just a moment ago, which is, how do we, instead of being overwhelmed by, and we don't even need to take it so seriously, we can take it playfully, and we can use these whatever easy access points that feel best without being overwhelming. So when I say that, I call it the 5% rule. So if you're able to limit some of the foods that might be having the biggest impact, or that's one side and easier for some, or can you add in more of the good ones that will help to nourish? Can I add in more good fat, like, extra virgin olive oil, specifically California has a great one. Can I add in more avocado, which has not only good fat, but also has lots of good fiber? That is what the gut microbiome actually needs to thrive. Instead of, okay, well, I'm going to beat myself up because I don't go to the gym enough. Instead of that, while I'm sitting at my desk, and this is going to come back to your question, while I'm sitting at my desk, isometric exercises, just squeezing your arms tight for 30 seconds, build up to a minute, do your legs, do your arms, do your shoulders. That actually increases the BDNF, the brain-derived neurotropic factor in the brain. okay, which then also feedbacks in reducing inflammation, helps our digestion. So it's these lighter lifts that we have so many different access points in order to start to, in real time, make these shifts to make our physiological state and also our physical health, our physiology itself, our biology, move into a safer state, and how that all plays together. So, of course, to the microbiome, a couple of baseline tools. So, our microbiome, number one, requires fibers in order to create all of the neurotransmitters, our digestion, our BDNF for our brain, in order to create short chain fatty acids. So, all of the things that we need to survive and thrive requires different vegetable fibers. So you can buy them. You can buy mixed powders. That's certainly available. There's also the idea of this is becoming much more popular. I've heard it on a couple podcasts lately. This idea of what's called the microbiome mashup, and they call it different things. Some people say take 20, 30 vegetables, but basically you can find it on YouTube, and you take the kids to the farmer's market, take your friend to the farmer's market, you buy a bunch of weird looking things you've never tried before, because our microbiome thrives on diversity, just like we do, right? The brain loves novelty, so does our gut. So switching it up, having lots of different fibers in there, that's actually going to create, it's going to feed all of the microbiome. And that's completely different than taking a probiotic, which is going to feed 2, 3, 5, 10 different diverse flora, as opposed to the hundreds, thousands, that we probably haven't even named yet.
Yeah. I think what I love what you first said is kind of in a way meeting, and this is so unique, and that's why I don't think it's a one size fits all, but it's kind of meeting the person where they are. Like, what's the easiest entry point? And I love that, because everyone is going to have a different entry point. They have a different starting point. But I think it's that 5%, or I even say 1%, which is based off Atomic Habits. But what is that one? Just start here. And what's that one little baby step? Or if you watch What About Bob, what's the baby step to just that changing, to do something that is more integrative and holistically healthy for you? What does it look like now? And eventually you'll get to make bigger changes, and then begin to do the food. Maybe you can't start with food. Maybe it's starting with like you said, the exercises at the desk. And maybe it's just, putting on a different type of music, or maybe it's starting with where you are. And I think it's so important, because it's not shaming. It's not like I'm beating myself up because I didn't do it, because I think that's such a common thing, that especially if someone's already under chronic stress, that they might want to tackle too much, and then they don't, and then they get stuck in that shame spiral. And then I'm sure that influences the gut more with the stress hormones being released,
Right.
and they kind of stay stuck. So I love that invitation to just what is the easiest entry point to begin this process, and not where you think you should be or what you see someone else doing, but where are you right now? What is that first little step to begin the process? Because that's going to be most beneficial for you. You spoke about some of the foods, and I'm wondering, think of the typical American diet, which is all over the place. Can you speak a little bit to how the typical American diet might cause some of this, and how more specifically some foods that might help counteract that? I know you mentioned avocado and some vegetables, but like, what are some things that we eat that tend to maybe add to that, versus here are some things that we can help counter that?
The microbiome requires what it requires, and it's typically very close to almost everyone. Whether someone, now some people who have what's called SIBO, or certain digestive injuries or digestive system injuries that have already occurred, right? They may require to start this process smaller. What happens is that eventually people get so much inflammation, so much bloating, so much intestinal damage, even though this will not show up if you go necessarily get a colonoscopy or an endoscopy, right? But you're feeling it when you eat. And then people start to limit their diet more and more. So then, I've spoken to people who are eating mono diets, or 2, 3 foods, or 5 foods, or they eat the same thing every day. What that does in this cycle is that now your digestive diversity is going down even more. So it's now this feedback loop that's keeping the person stuck. One of the cool things about using the mixed fiber process, you can start with an eighth of a teaspoon and chew it, because mastication is where our carbohydrates are generally digested, right? Saliva. So just chew it really well. And then and see how you feel. Maybe skip a day, right? But increasing that diversity is going to increase your ability to start to digest your food better, which increases the uptake of your nutrients. And then if we keep following that thread, as we're able to do that and our microbiome gets less inflamed, and then as we come back around this other side, what does that do? It starts to build in more resilience to our nervous system because we're not getting as many threat cues from our gut and also from the messages traveling up to our brain. And there's also liver gut axis. It's not just brain gut. We have all sorts of axis coming off the microbiome.
Yeah.
So, it's communication to all of our organs, right?
Yeah.
Which also what does that? The vagus nerve.
Yeah.
So, we can, the standard American diet, I don't think there's any lack of evidence on what kind of inflammation that causes, right? That's something that is pretty well established. And as you said, not everyone's first access point is going to be food.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, it's very threatening. It's very challenging. It brings up fear and stress at the idea of changing their diet.
Yeah.
So what if your visual system was an access point? So in other words, like when we're on the computer, when we're hyper-focused on our phones, our visual system is cueing our autonomic system constantly.
Yeah.
So what if we were able to take breaks from our computer for 5 minutes, every hour, and got up and walked around, or, used our phones, set one of those timers. Okay, 30 minutes less today. Because that hyperfixation where our eyes are not moving from side to side is actually contributing to that state, plus the flicker rate of the computer screens and all of that.
Yeah.
So continuing just with the visual system, maybe using blue blocking glasses at night, something that's easy to do, helps you sleep better. Then you get up and maybe look out the window, screen if it's cold, just the screen if it's cold, or go outside if you live somewhere warm, and get the early morning light on your eyes. Now you're sleeping better. What happens when you're sleeping? Your brain is actually getting a bath. So it's pushing out through this rhythm all of the toxins that have accumulated throughout the day. So now you have less inflammation neurologically. Are you going to be in a better mood? Yes. Are you going to be able to engage differently with people and connect more deeply? Yes. So, all of these different access points that are so much more achievable when we try and just say, I don't have to do everything. I don't have to eat perfectly. I don't have to cold plunge every day, although it's fantastic to do, or get in the sauna, all these other tools that aren't available to everyone. And some people just wouldn't do if it was sitting in their living room.
Yeah.
So, let's use the points of access through all of our system so that we can help the nervous system to get momentum, and that will change the lens that it sees, that it unconsciously perceives all input through. So there are people, when we get our nervous system into closer into a state that feels better for us, whether you want to call that ventral, parasympathetic, then we are less reactive and overreactive to the input coming in. There are some people who can watch those fast change shows who are the same exact age as me. I am just not one of them. Some people can go to really loud rock concerts and have the noise, have the flashing lights, and they feel completely at ease. Whereas not everyone at that same age is going to have that experience. But if their nervous system overall had felt more regulation going into that experience, perhaps it would have been different for them.
Yeah. I think it's important to note that there's a uniqueness to each individual. Now, I think there's generalizations, right? I think any regulated nervous system who can maybe handle a loud rock concert versus someone who maybe is too overstimulating, maybe, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, you could take both those people, but give them a really horrible food diet. And I think you would see I would assume some stress response or negative impact, like no matter how regulated someone is or what they can handle versus someone who can handle less stimulus. I would assume that a food group or eating poor food diet would have a negative impact regardless.
So that's a super question. Let's play with that just for a second.
Yeah.
So, our metabolic capabilities, right, are different at any moment and very highly linked to our stress, anxiety, and physiological state. So what you just said was very cool, because put the same food in, right, two people with continuous glucose monitors on,
Yeah.
And you're going to see that one person's spikes higher than the other. One person will stay sustained at a much higher level for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
And then the baseline recovery will take different amounts of time.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that's so important, just even forget about getting inflamed from fast food, right?
Mm-hmm.
Forget about the quality of whether it's real food or it's mostly things we can't digest, can't even pronounce, let alone digest.
Yeah.
Because that is just the biology of our bodies. We can adapt and make use of, because our bodies are so resilient and brilliant, they will make use of whatever it can, but we're still going to feel a certain way afterwards, right?
Yeah.
But so what you just pointed out is this idea that our own unique, just like our thumbprint, our fingerprints, we have a unique metabolic imprint that we can adjust. Our microbiome is going to be different. So our response to the foods that we're putting in, one person in a family can eat it, the other one can't. Typically, children will align with one or the other a little bit more closely digestively. So when I have a child who comes in and I can see that something is likely related to this food or that food, and I'll ask the parent, how do you feel when you eat that? Oh, terrible, terrible. And I'll explain. So the difference is you have a developed prefrontal cortex that tells you, don't go screaming and running from the room right now. That's not appropriate. Don't do that, but you'll have a migraine later. And the child is running, screaming, having a meltdown because they are experiencing in real time this reaction to the food that they've eaten.
That makes total sense. I have 3 kids, and one of them is neurodivergent, and my eldest, and you really can see more of a direct impact on food, 100%. Especially sugars. Well, sorry, not like fruit sugars, but like a candy or something. You could definitely see that. Where my other 2, you see it because of course it's going to have a spike, but nothing like my eldest. So it's interesting to see that yours, it's because it is different even between my wife and I, how foods impact. I might get maybe some gas here from this food and she's fine, and vice versa. So it's all so fascinating that I just think there's not enough education on specifically that in general.
Exactly.
You know?
And it's like if we weren't given the rule book,
Mm-mm.
and it's taken me more than half my life to put this in a way that I can finally understand and digest it all myself, and then start to share it, and I make all the digestive humor. I'm allowed to do it at this point, but ingest, digest, process, and excrete. That's what we do with information, with our food, with everything.
Yeah.
And so if we were able to give this information to children, right, they take that on very quickly. It might take them a minute, right? But they know when they are not feeling well. They know when they have crazy brain and it doesn't feel good to them either. They know that it is isolating for them to have behaviors that their parents get upset with. They don't actually want to feel that way or experience it. And so, as parents, we want to try and find a diet that helps them in their own nervous system. This is not just about physical health, right? This is about their moment to moment experience of what it feels like to be in their brain and body, and how it affects their self esteem if they are behaving in a way that's getting them in trouble at school. And, are we able to make these small changes for them as well? It might only be 1 or 2 things, but within us as adults, as we get older, our systems become less resilient. And so we really want to be, again, just finding where our access points are, adding in what feels like the lightest lift. Because if you do 5% put the glasses on, if you do 5% by changing, do intermittent walking, it's called, you can look it up, as opposed to just your regular 30-minute walk, which gets you 50% more benefits in some of the metrics. And then maybe you start to get that momentum, and 5, 10, 15, 20% that didn't feel like you broke a sweat to do, then changes our perception, our unconscious understanding of what's happening.
Yeah. It brings me back to what you shared earlier as we were talking, that kind of as you're cooking dinner, starting with like the family, then zooming out, that same with going to the foods we eat is one piece, but if we zoom out, we can see all the other impacts that it's having, and paying attention really just to with curiosity, I'd say, like with ourselves and even more with our kids. Like, hey, if I specifically with food, if I eat this or my kid does, am I aware? Am I paying attention to like what's occurring in them or what's occurring in me? Or am I just kind of like, just keep going kind of autopilot mindlessly and not paying attention? And either if it's myself feeling bad that I feel this way, or and I keep eating it and not changing, or my kids acting in such a way, and now I'm upset that they're acting this way, and now I'm stressed out. Or can I say, what's really going on here? And what's going on in me? Which I think does take a little bit more time, especially in our world of that is fast paced. So learning to slow down and pay attention. And so again, this goes back to the entry point thing of like, where's the beginning? Where can you start easily to get the momentum to then begin to pay attention a bit more and have that? I think it's like a muscle to be able to sit in that space to pay attention of curiosity and wonderment. And then something else you mentioned too, with like, you said that inflammation or gut may not always show up in a colonoscopy. Right? I think you said that, which is
100%.
which is interesting because I think I've heard a lot of people, they might be experiencing it, but don't know. And then they go to a typical, again, I'm generalizing here,
Huge
maybe go to a
problem.
typical doctor and it's like, everything's fine. Right. So how much is that affecting people? That should there be a shift in maybe some medicine? Like if BG had her way.
Okay. Yes. What you just said is such an important point. That is happening in so many different areas, not just with the gut, right? So someone feels, I don't quite digest right, I feel bloated, my stool is dysregulated, for a better word,
Yeah.
it's all over the place.
Sure,
It's having
sure.
mood swings and an emotional crisis.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, okay, so I go to my GP, right? Well, my GP said, I don't know, try taking fiber, try don't taking fiber, try taking this. Okay, no, that didn't work. Go to a GI. The GI looks, they do an endoscopy, they do a colonoscopy. Well, everything looks fine
Yeah.
because they're not looking at inflammation markers. So they're not necessarily going to see on the actin level, it's called, that the lining of the intestine is inflamed, right? So it could be microscopically inflamed, but that is enough to be triggering these symptoms.
Wow.
And so you think about the actin layer, the internal layer of the intestines is like, there's one scratch, you're fine, it's going to heal. 2 scratch, 3 scratch, 5 scratch, 10 scratch. That's getting scratched by not only the food we eat, but the hormones of stress constantly, right? And so it is that feedback loop that we really want to become aware of. And it's the same when we're talking about children and their gut. Never before has there been this, I don't even know what to call it, an epidemic or consistent pattern that, children are being given, are coming with constipation and diarrhea. Just, it seems like every little baby is having something. And what do they get? They get given these products. I'm not going to name them, but
That's right. Yep.
fiber products that were never meant to be used with children or anyone long term. But what is the gut function? It is a function of our autonomic system, right? That is an end product that comes out. The stool, the ability to go from oral to end, it has so many autonomic processes in between there.
Yeah.
So really, we need to be looking at the autonomic nervous system. Dr. Porges says, if you could peel everything off, it would be the autonomic nervous system as the underlying, driving mechanism here.
Yeah.
And so, if a child's having trouble, they go to a pediatrician.
Right.
They're not getting answers. And then they grow to be 1 or 2 years old and they're having neurological challenges or behavioral challenges, right? And so who do they go to? A psychologist, a neurologist, but they're not giving them the tools either that they were looking for. Is very frustrating for a family who's trying and doing all the right investigation, and they're not finding results.
Yeah.
And just as a reminder, not a reminder, but the way that we frame it is, if you picture the hierarchy within the body, it's an interoceptive, neuroceptive level at the gut level. It is where we are, it's subconscious what we are processing. And then we have this chemical cocktail that gets created of hormones and all of the different neurotransmitters. And that gives us feelings. Right? So now we have the feelings, which then now the brain's like, okay, let me create the story around this.
Yeah.
based on history and predictive ability, which is brilliant at. And then we get the behavior, the external expression. And so many children are getting diagnosed and over-pathologized at this behavior level, where really it is an end result of some predictable patterns that happen for many people.
I think it's an important thing, that more important because I don't think we generally as a society think of that first as a place to begin with. But then more specifically, the gut and what we eat, and how going to certain doctors, again, not to, I'm not here to negate Western medicine.
Of course not.
It
We
does
need
amazing.
them.
We need them.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, it's like when we go and they can't see it, and then people are left feeling like, well, something's off, but they say it's fine. So now what do I do? I guess, do you have anything to say, like a next step or something, or what someone could do or might be able to do, or where to go to check if everyone's saying it's fine, but they know something's off?
First, I mean, what you just said is so, when someone experiences that, and I certainly have, it's so invalidating. And it makes me want to jump out of my own experience and turn away from what I'm feeling, because I've been told I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I've been told that what I experience and what I'm having happen is incorrect, and there's something wrong with me.
Yeah.
Because this authority figure is not able to tell me how to track back to, to solve this problem. So I think that number one is a tremendous thing that can be acknowledged, especially for anyone who's experiencing that, that your experience is there to try and help you, right? And just because the person that you've seen so far, or the 10 people you've seen so far, haven't been able to name it for you, that everything is guiding us back to homeostasis in the best way possible.
Yeah.
Even with people who experience autoimmunity, our body, people will feel like their body is trying to hurt them. They want to check out even more, but really our body is trying to guide us back to that homeostasis, because our cells are brilliantly designed to, no matter what goes in, it will optimize that experience in the most way that it can. So, when people, that's a challenging question that you posed, because it depends which part of the body is being impacted.
Yeah.
And not all, it was Dr. Porges who actually gave me the name for what I do now. So, before it was functional medicine. And then on stage, when I heard him talking last year, it was neurointegrative medicine. Travis, when I tell you, everything went up in me, and I went, oh, thank you. That is what I do. I prioritize the nervous system. Yes, it's functional medicine. Yes, we want to look a little bit deeper at these other processes that can help create less stressors in the nervous system. Yes, add in more safety producing tools, right? So that we can then engage, more deeply with each other, which of course just fulfills all of the needs there. So I would say that simple things that you can do, you can just play a little bit with some of the tools that we talked about, which are, let me think about my senses, right? My visual input, my auditory input, my proprioceptive input. Proprioception is the input that we get through our joints and our muscles that go to our brain, that tell us where we are in time and space. That makes our brain feel safe. So if we're not getting walking or pushing exercises, it is another easy access point that we can do. Just do wall pushes. Okay, actually makes your body feel really good. So our other senses, where else are we accessing? Our vestibular system. As we get older, we don't turn our heads as much. We don't look around. We get a little stiff. And vestibular function is very important, again, for time and space. So anything you said, our food, but I would say any access, any ingestion point, and that's our senses, including the vestibular, proprioceptive, interoceptive, and then of course neuroceptive, which we don't have conscious control over. But all of the things we've talked about will shift the lens of the neuroception as it relates to the nervous system, and the cues that we then ultimately end up with, moving us more towards safe enough or more towards a state of heightened threat.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, again, it's really, you said it's so where is those different entry points, not just food, which is important, but all the other entry points and how that impacts our gut and our brain and our autonomic nervous system. And as we kind of come to a close, I know that you have an upcoming course here that integrates gut health, emotional resilience, and the vagus nerve. I'm wondering, and I think it might be a good place as people are listening to this, that if they want to learn more about what we're talking about, I'm guessing more of a deep dive, what you're doing in your course. Can you speak a little bit about what people like, what to expect if they were to take it, and what they might learn from it, and some takeaways?
Sure. So the course is basically everything we talked about here, but on, as you said, a much deeper level.
Mm.
I was very grateful that Dr. Porges agreed to do a module with me.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to dive into some of his work on the brain-gut axis. He has, sort of moved into some of that. His most recent paper was phenomenal. So the course is going to talk about, yes, from a polyvagal theory, which really is how do I apply that lens? And as you said, it's like once you know it, then everything sort of, you can see it through everything. So, how do we use these access points? And also, what else are we not aware of that are impacting us? So I call them micro traumas, internal and external micro traumas. And where are those eroding our safe enough state? And where can we make, again, these easy adjustments that might create some change? So, I go through more of, I do case studies in the course. So it's for professionals and for individuals. And I do have a module in there specifically on children because, my hashtag is Save Childhood, because I really believe that, there's a train that hit a wall about 15 years back and kids are flying through the air, that we really want to create this cushioned landing for them. And then also, help navigate them back to their safety. So, I talk about the all of the different senses. We go over supplementation, which does play a role in today's world because none of us are eating enough of the right things or digesting enough of the right things. Even if you wrote it all down and broke it down, they have apps that do that. It's shocking for me too. How little of the right nutrients, if I digested and absorbed it exactly as it went in, which no one does, am I getting? And wow, if we can sort of create a little levity for the body so it's not such a heavy drain to get through our day metabolically, it's a huge difference. And so, that's the foundation of the course, is to connect, as I say, help people connect more deeply with themselves, with each other, and then the world around them. And that includes some of the somatic work and the expert interviews with some phenomenal people, Jan Winhall and Michael Allison. We're going to have Maddie on there, Linda Ty, Dr. Porges, of course, and then some people that I brought in that are mitochondria experts. One is a sleep expert, a vision therapy expert, one who works with vestibular, because these are all of those other senses and ingestion points that we don't necessarily realize are impacting our moment-to-moment anxiety and chronic stress.
Well, it sounds like very robust course you put together. I actually am probably gonna take it myself because I want to learn more. And I'm wondering if anyone else with any other work you're doing, they want to find your work to follow, outside of PVI, where could we find you? Where could we follow you? Where would that be?
Sure. So the Instagram is Brain Gut Institute, and I put a lot of posts there also about children.
Okay.
On LinkedIn, I put posts, BG Mancini. I post a lot on there for people who are professionals and to help them to see through this lens to better help their clients and patients and themselves. Because as a provider myself, not getting burnt out and having those touch points for myself, and so that the lift isn't as heavy with each individual when everyone's presenting more medically complex. So I feel like, building that community of people who are looking through different lenses is really important. Yeah, so those are the ways to reach me. And bgmancini.com is also available to see me there.
Awesome. And those that are listening, all those links will also be in the description on the YouTube or on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You'll be able to find all those links clickable to get to BG's work as well as the course. BG, thank you so much. I think this is such a rich conversation. And I know that, we're kind of tip of the iceberg here and that there's so much more, but I think it's a great just kind of open door to like see okay, wow, there's a lot of connection here, and there's a lot of ways in which we can kind of help bring integration, holistic health to each individual's bodies, and kind of starting where they are. And so I think it's such a needed conversation to have more of, and especially now that you say with kids, I think helping teach our kids at such a young age to help educate them on all the vast ways in which we're connected is, I think that's how we're going to change our world, is through kind of the work that you're doing and the work that PBI is putting out there. I think is so integrative. So I'm so excited. So thank you for your time, and thank you for
Thank you,
sharing.
Travis. This was really enjoyable.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to Wired for Connection, a Polyvagal podcast produced by Polyvagal Institute. New episodes of this podcast are published monthly. Follow Polyvagal Institute on social media to learn more about upcoming guests and episode release dates. To learn more about polyvagal theory